So before we start, I wanted to let you know that this is going to be probably one of my most serious podcast episodes that I have recorded so far. I think in the past 3 seasons that I have done. So this might be triggering for some of you. So I want to start with a disclaimer, right? It's going to be very important for me to say this to you before we begin. In no way am I a licensed therapist, a clinical psychologist, or a psychiatrist, and therefore today's discussion is solely based on published research pertaining to ASA. If you don't know what that means adult sexual assault, client stories, and my own personal experience. I will talk about published statistical research pertaining to ASA amongst gay and bisexual men, and I will talk about my own experience with sexual abuse. So if this is something that you find to be triggering, I would highly recommend jumping off the episode now. But let's start with, if you believe that you are a victim of ASA, I would highly recommend speaking with your physician to get a referral to a licensed therapist. Speak to your therapist if you already have one, or reach out to the sexual abuse hotline. If you don't have that information, the number is 1-800-656-4673. I will also provide that information in the details down below. Now, I need you to hear me when I tell you this. You are not alone, and it will be okay. You are not broken. You are not unlovable. You didn't deserve it, and you do not need to be ashamed. These are all things that I myself experienced after I was sexually abused. And the truth is, I didn't even realize that I was abused until years later. And in that moment, when it happened, I knew something was wrong, but because I am a bisexual male who consented to going back to this guy's apartment, I felt like it was my fault, right? The people pleaser in me also didn't want to label him as an abuser, because what if he wasn't, right? What if he was just caught up in the moment and didn't realize what he was doing? And if I labeled him as abuser, that meant that I was a victim, and that wasn't a reality that I was willing to face at the time, to be 100% honest. You have to understand, I grew up in a Latino household with a father whose attitude could be classified as machismo, right? He was not someone who really shared feelings, or you shared your feelings with, because he had a quick temper and it made you feel unsafe. But let me clarify. I don't mean in the sense that I felt physically unsafe, although back then we did take beatings. I mean in an emotional sense, right? So I learned to just suck it up. I learned to not feel sorry for myself, because if I did, it was a sign of weakness. I learned to not be a victim, basically. So how did this all come about, right? Let me tell you my story. I'm going back now a little bit. So this was, I want to say I was my second or my third year in college. I had just broken up with my girlfriend at the time. We had been together for 2.5 years. I had come out to her as bisexual, and we agreed that I needed some time to explore my sexuality and all of those things. It was not an easy situation. I already was carrying a lot of shame at the time, because in my coming out to her, it was very emotional for her. It was very difficult for her to process. Not that she wasn't understanding or caring or any of those things, because she was, and I'm very grateful to her for that. But it was tough on her, as I would have expected it to be. So I kind of already started this journey with some underlying shame, not to mention the shame that I had bottled up for years growing up and, being a kid and feeling different and in middle school and being made fun of and having a very, you know, what some most would define a masculine male figure in my life being my father. So I am in college. I am getting comfortable with the idea of potentially being intimate with somebody of the same sex. I'm online. I'm looking up chat rooms. I'm looking up apps that you can utilize to meet people and all of that stuff. And there was just something about that at the time that just didn't feel comfortable to me, right? It just didn't feel right. I had met some people through my college experience, but nothing that ever really amounted to something. I had my first kiss with a guy at that same college. His name is Kyle. And, he was a really good friend. We were in the same acting class and all of that stuff. But fast forward to the actual event itself. Myself and two of my friends decided to go out to a club in Hollywood. And if you are not familiar with Hollywood, Hollywood is littered with clubs all over the place, particularly in the West Hollywood area. So we went to a club and the intention was just to have a good time, right? To go out, have a good time. It had been a while since we had gone out and all that stuff. So we're out and I was taking a dance course at the time. It was an introduction to modern dance. And I remember distinctly there was this guy that was in the class, and for some reason I was just drawn to him, right? There was something about him that was attractive. I didn't know much about him. I didn't know his information, his name. I didn't know any of that stuff, but I did know that I was attracted to him. Anyways, so the thing was, I thought he was straight. I didn't think that he was gay or bisexual in any ways. He never put off that kind of energy. He was very kind of reserved to himself. He was foreign in the sense that he was a foreigner, not that he was foreign to me, but I guess you can say that he was foreign to me as well. And so we're at the club, we're dancing. It's a gay club. And I see him in the crowd and I was like, oh my God, that's the guy that is in my dance class. So my friends tell me that I should go and talk to him or whatever. So I go up to him and I introduce myself and he says that he knows who I am and blah, 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 all that fun stuff. So we dance the night away, right? We have a really good time and he invites me to go back to his apartment. Now, at the time, this technically would have been the first hookup situation I was in. So I remember just being so nervous and anxious and like excited all at the same time. But I had been dancing at the club all night. I was sweaty as shit. I probably smelled. I was like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. So I run back to my friend's house. She lived in Beverly Hills and I showered super quick. And I remember telling my friends that I would text them in the morning and let them know how everything went. So I get in the car and I drive to this guy's place. And at the time, this guy lived in the dormitories, or not the dormitories, but apartments around UCLA. So I get there. It's one of those like security apartments. So like you have to be buzzed in or whatever. I get buzzed in, I go upstairs. And we kind of start to get to know each other. We start to talk, we start to do all that stuff. He gives me a drink. And we go into his room. He starts to play the piano. And before you know it, things progress, right? I don't think I need to go in too much detail about that, but you probably get where I'm going with that. So we start to become a little bit more intimate. We start to make out. We start to do all those things. And I remember in that moment, I was feeling like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like this is my first real experience with something like this. And this is something that like, I mean, and if you are somebody who grew up gay or bisexual and you knew at a very young age, this is something that you have fantasized about for a very long time. This is something that's been in your brain for a really long time. And when it finally comes to fruition, there's all of this excitement and energy and anxiety and all these things that are coupled with that experience, right? So I remember things started off really nice. He was super sweet. He was super intimate. He was a fantastic kisser. And, he was French, so French have a tendency of being really great kissers. But so as things start to progress, I remember thinking to myself, okay, oh my God, this is going to get to a point where we actually become fully intimate, right? We're fully naked on the bed, all of that stuff. And I remember in that moment, I didn't really know what to do. But all I remember is the exchange of energy that we had. I knew that I was probably going to be the receiver in that situation, or the bottom in that situation. And it was my first time ever having that experience. And so I just remember it starting off okay, and then it not being okay anymore after that point. I remember several times I had asked him to stop, and he didn't. I told him several times to slow down because it hurt, and he didn't. And at this point, it was one of those situations where, like, he was taller than I was. He was far more muscular than I was. And you kind of just go into this, like, catatonic state. And it's almost like an acceptance of the situation, because you realize in that moment there really isn't anything that you can do to get out of that situation. And I remember just kind of laying there being like, God, I just want this to be over. At some point, I just want this to be over. And at some point during that interaction, I remember at one point to be frank, he pulled out, and I was like, oh, okay, it's over. And then I remember just this, like, sharp pain because he had put it right back in again. And what I came to realize later was that he had actually taken off the condom without telling me, without my permission, without my consent in any way, and finished inside of me. And it was one of these situations where it's like, you would think that by all the content that we consume as young teenagers and adults of porn and all of these things, and how it's so eroticized, and how it's supposed to be this really kind of amazing experience to be dominated and all of these things. I just remember sitting there being like, that is not what this was at all. And I remember getting up and going to the restroom and just kind of sitting in the restroom for a minute being like, what just happened? Like, what was this experience? And I remember a friend telling me a while ago that, you know, if that ever happens, right, if a person finishes in you, you want to try to get it out and all of that stuff. So I remember sitting on the toilet trying to get it out, and I just remember wiping and seeing blood. And I was like, oh my God, I'm bleeding. And I didn't know if it was because I had torn. I didn't know if it was because what injury. I didn't know. I just remember seeing the blood. I just remember being like, okay, I just have to deal with this. I just have to suck it up and get past this moment. So I cleaned myself up. I went back into the bedroom, and the craziest fucking thing of all is I remember getting back into bed with this guy and falling asleep and waking up the next morning and him wanting to do it again. And at that point, I was like, absolutely fucking not. Like, that is not happening. So I grabbed my shit and I left, and I never spoke to that guy again. But the most awkward thing about that entire situation was that I had to see him in dance class every week for the next, like, month or so. And I think I just blocked it out. I think I just kind of pretended like everything was fine, like nothing happened, and went on with my life. He never attempted to talk to me again, which, I mean, obviously now in hindsight, I'm like, asshole. But again, I kind of bottled it all up, right? And that was my introduction to my first sexual experience in the queer community. I'm actually really surprised I got through that without getting emotional, because usually whenever I talk about it, I get pretty emotional. So I don't know if I should be congratulating myself or if I need to check in with myself and figure out if I'm disassociating right now. But all that to say that was my introduction to that. And I remember after that, I met a couple of other guys. Nothing was an experience like that was, but I just remember being very guarded at that point. And after about a year of exploration, I got back into a relationship with my ex-girlfriend, and we stayed together for another 10 years, 11 years. Towards the end of that relationship, I ended up going to therapy because I was having a lot of anger issues. I was getting really frustrated and very angry. I was very short-tempered. I was very triggered by a lot of things. And I knew that I needed to get help. I knew that I needed to talk to somebody. So I went to a therapist and we started unpacking stuff. And when that topic came up, I remember my therapist looking at me and saying, "Dude, you were sexually abused. Do you realize that?" And I was like, no, I wasn't. It was just a really bad experience and blah, blah, blah. And I remember just denying the shit out of it. And he was like, no, like that you were abused. And you need to sit with that for a little bit, because essentially what you've been doing is that you've been repressing that memory, that experience for the past 10 years, and it's coming out in many different ways. Now, granted, it wasn't just that I was struggling with. There was other things that I was struggling with as well. But I remember actually in that moment, I was like, holy shit, like I was sexually abused, The first time I spoke about my experience that night with my therapist, I remember feeling this like sense of relief and anxiety all at the same time. Relief because I finally unearthed this like dark secret I had hidden from the world and myself for 10 plus years. The anxiety, I later came to realize, was because the truth was now out there. So I couldn't deny the existence of the experience. And that meant I had to acknowledge that I was a victim, right? A word that I despised because it meant I was weak, or that I was wounded, or worse yet, that I was helpless. And what I've come to understand over the years about being a victim is a couple things, right? The first one is the term victim applies to my situation because of the factors that were involved. I was harmed and I was tricked. That does not mean I am forever labeled a victim. The other thing here is my relationship with the word itself had to change, because if it did not change, I was not really going to be able to heal and move past the event. If I was unable to accept that I was a victim in that situation, I would never be able to even accept that the situation happened. I wouldn't even be sitting here having a conversation with you about it. I wouldn't be open and candid about the experience, because I would still be living in denial and I would be invalidating myself, And the other thing here is I was a victim, but I'm not anymore, right? Choosing to hide the event because I was ashamed, embarrassed, and in denial gave my abuser the power. The moment I was able to give that experience a voice, I took all my power back. I went from a victim to a survivor, essentially. And, survivor is a term that I also struggle with saying. And if you are somebody who has ever been a victim of sexual abuse, right, adult sexual abuse, then you probably know what I'm talking about, right? Like all these words that kind of, there's this shame that's attached to it, or this kind of like you're trying to label yourself as like some hero or somebody who like survived this event. And the reality is you survived that event. You for me, for example, went into a catatonic state and just kind of adapted to the situation and dealt with it until it was finished. And I was able to get out of that situation and live a somewhat normal life. I survived that situation. A lot of people don't. A lot of people really struggle with that mentally and emotionally and physically. A lot of people close off from the world. A lot of people have mental breakdowns. A lot of people commit suicide after situations like that. So yeah, I did survive that situation. And I have to constantly remind myself that it's not a bad term to use, right? It doesn't mean that I'm trying to put myself on a pedestal in any way. It's just the reality of the situation. And yeah, I don't know. It's the sad reality is I don't even think that he realizes what he did to me. But he didn't fit the profile of an abuser. Instead, he kind of fit the profile of like the selfish, self-centered asshole who was just interested in finishing. And as I say that out loud, it kind of does fit the profile of an abuser. What I'm saying is, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it didn't feel calculated or malicious, right? It felt immature and reckless, but regardless, it was sexual abuse no matter how you spin it. And this is the first time that I have ever spoken about this out loud in a public environment like this. And I have to say that I feel pretty exposed right now. But the truth is, I'm okay with that. I wanted to speak on this because this happens more frequently than you might think, right? Unfortunately, there is not a lot of information or research on male sexual abuse within the queer community. But what I did come across when I was researching this was pretty interesting, right? And the first study that I came across was conducted, I want to say it was in 2013, and it was by the Center of Disease Control in the United States. And in that study, 40% of gay men and nearly half of bisexual men, right, around 47%, compared to 21% of heterosexual men experienced sexual violence during their lifetime. The remainder of the studies that I read and that I researched showed similar results, basically. But if you look at combined studies pertaining to ASA, they estimate that anywhere between 14 to 20% of gay and bisexual men have experienced some form of sexual abuse. That's a really high number, guys, and I don't even know if you realize that. And if that is the case, why aren't we talking about this more, right? Why isn't there a Me Too movement for us? Why isn't this something that is being discussed in the halls of Congress? And in my opinion, there's a few reasons for this, right? I think the first one here is that we are men, and men don't get sexually abused. And if you do, it's something to be ashamed of. At least that's what it feels like society has taught us. The second thing here is that we are queer men, which means our sexual identity in the eyes of society is unfortunately linked to this common misconception of promiscuity. So it's not sexual abuse if we're asking for it. The third thing is many of us have grown up watching pornography as a means to educate ourselves, right? Because there isn't a healthy education system for us as queer individuals. And we learn that intimacy between two men looks like rough, dominant sex, right? Unfortunately, that world of porn comes with its dark corners. So many of us saw these kind of domination, abuse, rough sex videos and started to view it as normal. And look, listen to me, there's nothing wrong with that as long as it is between two consenting adults. But even then, the lines can be easily blurred. So we have to be very cognizant of those things. Listen, I'm not speaking about my experience to get pity in any way, right? I don't want anybody to feel sorry for me. That is the last thing that I want. That does not mean I will not accept someone's kindness. I won't accept somebody's empathy, and I will not accept somebody's compassion when they hear about my story. But seeking validation and attention is not the goal here. The goal is to share my story so that anyone out there that has experienced something and feels alone, right? If this is you and you feel alone, knowing that you're not alone, right? If this is you, again, I want to reiterate, you're not alone. If this is you, you don't have to go out and scream it from the mountaintops now, right? Acceptance and healing comes with time. And when you are ready to confront the experience, you will. I know how scary the journey to acceptance can be. I've been there. I've walked that journey myself, so I get it. And here is what I wish I would have known back then, that I reflect on now in hindsight. The first one is avoidance doesn't make it go away. It just keeps it tucked away until you are ready to confront it. The second thing here is healing begins when you change your perception of the word victim. As men, we are taught that being a victim is something to be ashamed of, and it's not, right? Being a victim means that you experienced something that can become your superpower in the future, that can become your superpower in the present. It allows you to be more empathetic, to be more patient, to be more understanding. And all of those things are beautiful if you're able to manage them properly. The third thing here is having a support system makes a huge difference. If you don't feel like you can share your experience with your friends and your family because you're afraid of judgment or what they might think or criticism, share it with a licensed mental health professional. It is likely you will have some trauma there, right? And having a licensed therapist to walk you through those things can be the difference between life and death, if I'm being 100% honest with you. And the fourth thing here is you are not broken. The experience itself is incredibly unfortunate, and it's not something you deserved. Be patient with yourself and understand that certain situations might make you uncomfortable now and in the future. And if that is the case, it's okay to say no. It's a very powerful word. It's a word that I don't think is used frequently enough. And it's a word that I think is used in a lot of wrong ways. You can say no if you feel uncomfortable, if you feel unsafe, if you feel triggered. You do not have to remain in that environment. You do not have to be a people pleaser anymore. You do not have to feel sorry or guilty about what the other person may feel or may experience, because at the end of the day, you have to make sure that you are protecting your own emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual health above anything else. I hope you found this episode to be insightful, to be helpful. I hope it was not too triggering for you. I hope that in me sharing my story with you, if this is something that you have experienced yourself, and even if it is something that you have not experienced, that you learned something today about this subject. I think it's an incredibly important topic. I think it's not talked about often enough. The fact that there are anywhere between 14 to 20% gay and bisexual men that have experienced sexual abuse in their life is an incredibly high number. And it's something that I think needs to be talked about more and needs to be discussed. And that is the entire purpose of why I recorded this episode. If you have been a victim of ASA, again, I will provide the information that you need down below. Feel free to send me a private message or an email. If you'd like to share your story with me, I would be more than happy to listen and be a non-judgmental ear. I hope you guys are having an amazing day. And next episode, I promise you, will not be such a downer, but it was necessary. All right, I will see you guys in the next episode. And again, do all the good stuff. If you liked it, if you enjoyed the episode, if you felt like you got something from it, please make sure that you are subscribing to the podcast and that you are checking out all my other social media platforms. I'll see you guys later.